Hello! Today we are going to talk about the myth of the patron of Attica, Poseidon versus Athena. This version of the myth is adapted from Biblioteca, Book 3, Chapter 14.1, which is written by Pseudo Apollodorus in the 2nd century AD. When the world was younger, many of the gods were seeking to claim cities as their own. Poseidon came to the capital of Attica and sought to be worshipped by the people there. As proof of his great power, he created a magnificent spring of water on the Acropolis. The water was as salty as the ocean. Athena appeared before the citizens of the city then, also wanting to be worshipped by them. To prove her worth as their patron, she planted a great olive tree, from which oil and olives could be harvested. The other gods judged that Athena was the winner because the olive tree was the better gift. Athena then renamed the city after herself, Athens. Poseidon was so angry that he planned to flood the city and the surrounding area. Zeus, king of the gods, then sent Hermes to stop the flooding of the city. So, a few notes about this version of the myth. The earliest reference to this myth that survives today is actually from Plato in the 4th century BCE. That's 600 years before this version was written down. We're not sure how different those versions would have been. Plato's reference is pretty short, but he does talk about Athena and Poseidon competing over Athens. The writer, Apollodorus, doesn't actually mention that the spring Poseidon created was salt water in his version. However, this is a real spring that does exist in Athens. It's up on top of the Acropolis, and it does contain salty water. Other writers, like the Latin poet Ovid, comment on this in their retellings, so I included it here. Athena's olive tree also seems to be a reference to a real life, very old olive tree that was still alive in Athens when the writer wrote this myth down. How old that olive tree was, we aren't sure, but there are other references from other writers to this specific olive tree. Now, in Virgil's version of this myth, Poseidon gives the city a horse instead of a spring of salt water. Poseidon's also the god of horses, so that makes sense. This version originally actually just ends with Poseidon flooding the city. But a writer at the same time, Pseudo, who also wrote in that 2nd century AD timeframe, he specifies that Zeus sent Hermes to stop him from doing this. One last note, this is also not the only time that Athena and Poseidon clash in Greek myth. They have a long-standing rivalry that happens in many myths. It's what causes Medusa to be cursed as one of their conflicts. And also in the Odyssey about Odysseus, Poseidon is the one who tries to keep Odysseus away from home, and Athena is trying to get him back to Ithaca. So as you think about this myth, try to consider what this myth reveals about the values of the Greek people at the time. What were things that they valued more than others? And what were some things that they feared? What can this myth tell us about the culture of Greek at the time it was written? Here are some possible answers. The value of olives and olive oil. Olives were a staple food for the Greeks and still is to this day. Olives are a super useful crop. One of the themes might be that useful gifts are more important than impressive ones. Poseidon creating a saltwater spring on top of the Acropolis, so high up, is a very impressive feat, but it's not a very useful one. A saltwater spring can't be used for water, whereas the olive, while it's less impressive looking, would have been much more useful. This myth might also reflect a fear of earthquakes and floods. Earthquakes and flooding are very common in the Mediterranean and would have been a very frightening prospect for people at the time. And lastly, this myth also just portrays Athens as a truly blessed city. It's such a great city that the gods themselves are fighting over it. What other possible things could this myth reveal to us about Greek myth and culture?